Emergency debate, the death of the middle class. Only the top 1% will survive. Speakers, Nick Hanauer and Daniel Priestley, in conversation with host Stephen Bartlett. Source, The Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett, YouTube, https://u2.be/ulbshxnuau. Date, June 8, 2026. 2 backgrounds, 1 warning. Nick Hanauer and Daniel Priestley arrive at this conversation from opposite ends of the economic spectrum, yet they land on the same alarm bell. Hanauer was raised in a civic-minded, middle-class family in Seattle. His father worked in a small family business making bed pillows and down comforters, which is where Hanauer got his first taste of commerce. A youthful conviction about the internet's future led him to a friend named Jeff Bezos, and together they built Amazon.com, with Hanauer becoming its first non-family investor. He went on to help build manufacturing and e-commerce businesses and later sold an internet advertising company to Microsoft for $6.4 billion. What redirected his life, though, was a set of IRS tax tables he studied in 2007 and 2008. They showed that the top 1% of Americans held about 8.5% of national income in 1980, and that this had roughly tripled to 22% by 2007, while the bottom half of the country saw its share fall from 18% to 12%. Projecting that trend forward convinced him the endpoint was not a policy inconvenience but a threat to democracy itself, and he has spent the years since trying to understand what caused it and how to reverse it. He talks openly about pitchforks, the idea that when inequality reaches extremes, history shows societies tip into either a police state or a revolution. Daniel Priestley's path started in Australia, where he discovered entrepreneurship as a teenager and, at 21, built his first agency from $0 to $1 million in its first year and $10 million by year 3, without ever taking venture capital, funding it instead through credit cards. For the past 15 years, he has run an entrepreneur accelerator that has worked with more than 5,500 businesses worldwide. Watching the last 25 years of technological change up close, he has come to believe that the digital economy has hollowed out the middle class just as thoroughly as Hanauer's data suggests, and that if ordinary people cannot find a way to participate in the gains of capitalism, they will eventually vote for something far more radical. Both men describe themselves as capitalists. Their disagreement is not about whether the middle class is in trouble, they agree completely that it is, but about what, exactly, broke it, and what would fix it. The numbers behind the inequality. Hanauer treats a single statistic as the most important fact in the American economy. The median full-time worker today earns around $60,000 a year. Had that worker's pay kept pace with their historical share of GDP since 1975, they would be earning close to $120,000, roughly double. The same pattern holds further up the income ladder. Someone earning $180,000 today would be earning closer to $250,000 under the old distribution. Over the past 50 years, virtually all the benefit of economic growth and productivity gains has flowed to the top 10% of earners, and disproportionately to the top 1%, representing trillions of dollars a year that used to be ordinary wages and now sit in the accounts of the wealthiest people instead. This didn't happen by accident, in Hanauer's telling. He traces it to a specific policy turn in the mid-1970s, when a set of ideas often called neoliberalism, Reaganomics in the United States, Thatcherism in Britain, took hold, cut taxes on the wealthy, deregulate powerful industries, and suppress ordinary wages, on the theory that the benefits would eventually trickle down. GDP growth in the United States ran at 4 to 4.5% through the 1940s, 50s and 60s. Once these policies took over, growth fell first to 3% and now sits closer to 2%. Bartlett adds context from broader data. The United States is now the most unequal of the G7 nations, with its top 1% holding more than 30% of national wealth compared with roughly 20% in the UK, even as the American economy has grown more than twice as fast as Britain since 2019. Naming the real enemy, megacore and megafunds. Priestley resists the idea that taxing wealthy individuals is the right target. He argues it is easy to point at a billionaire and call him the villain, but the people actually hollowing out the middle class are harder to see: enormous corporations and enormous investment funds that now rival nations in size. He draws a sharp line between entrepreneurs who build something people want, a James Dyson vacuum cleaner, a catalogue of Beatles songs, and the mechanisms he considers the true drain on ordinary economies: multinational companies that route their profits through low-tax jurisdictions, and private equity funds that buy up housing stock purely to extract rent from it. He points to Amazon booking British sales through Luxembourg, Google routing through Ireland, and Starbucks paying brand licensing fees to a subsidiary in Bermuda, all while a corner coffee shop or a family-run pub pays full tax on every pound of revenue. During the conversation, Bartlett fact-checks one specific claim in real time. The popular idea that BlackRock is directly buying up British homes turns out to be a myth. BlackRock is a financier providing loans to developers, not a landlord holding residential property itself. But a related and verified example survives the fact-check. Lloyds Bank's Citra Living division is buying tens of thousands of newly built homes specifically to rent out permanently, treating the shift away from home ownership as a long-term profit opportunity. Alongside this, sovereign wealth funds from Qatar and Norway now own significant portions of London property. Priestley's point stands even after the correction: whoever the specific institutions are, capital increasingly treats British and American housing as an investment asset class rather than shelter, and that shift, not personal wealth, is what he considers the real threat to the middle class. The wages argument: optionality versus power. Priestley's core belief is that optionality does more to raise wages than any government policy. If a worker has 10 companies competing to hire them, he argues, they will never accept poor conditions. Wages rise naturally wherever there is enough competition among employers for a limited pool of workers. He wants entrepreneurship taught in school specifically so that starting a business becomes a visible option for anyone, rather than a mysterious path reserved for a few. Hanauer agrees with the theory but insists it almost never plays out this way in the real world, where employers hold nearly all the leverage. He traces the intellectual justification for this imbalance back to 1879, when Henry George published Progress and Poverty, a book arguing that the rich were effectively stealing from the poor, and which became the best-selling book in American history at the time. The reaction from the era's financial establishment was swift. J.P. Morgan brought an economist named John Bates Clark to Columbia University specifically to counter the argument, and Clark responded with a book called The Distribution of Wealth, which introduced what economics now calls the theory of marginal productivity, the idea that, because markets are efficient, whatever a person earns precisely reflects the value they create. Hanauer notes that Clark was explicit in his own writing about the purpose of the theory: to convince working people that their pay reflected their true worth, so that they would not conclude they were being underpaid and revolt. Even Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, recognized this basic asymmetry of power between employers and workers. Priestley adds a modern illustration: when a single job posting draws 400 qualified applicants, an employer has no incentive to raise wages, because someone equally capable will always take the position at the going rate, a dynamic he says is common across the UK right now. From this shared diagnosis, Hanauer draws a policy conclusion: living wage laws such as a minimum wage and a robust overtime threshold are essential correctives. In the United States, the 40-hour overtime standard used to apply to virtually every worker in 1970. Today it covers less than 10%, which Hanauer argues has allowed employers, at scale, to convert 3 40-hour jobs into 2 60-hour jobs and pocket the savings, a mechanism he estimates has removed millions of jobs from the workforce. He points to Seattle's introduction of a $15 minimum wage, which he helped bring about, as evidence that raising wages broadly does not destroy the businesses that pay them, because everyone in the local economy ends up with more money to spend. He illustrates the stakes with a simple comparison: a ham sandwich costs 25 cents in Somalia and $25 in Switzerland, a proxy, he suggests, for the kind of economy people actually want to live in. America and Britain, two different bargains. The two economies offer a natural experiment. Britain has spent 2 decades building a strong floor under workers, a minimum wage pegged to 2/3 of the national median, 28 days of guaranteed paid holiday, sick leave, maternity and paternity leave, a 48-hour weekly cap, and strong protection against dismissal after 6 months on the job. Yet Priestley points out that none of this has produced runaway prosperity. Britain currently has around 1 million young people out of work, sluggish growth, and, by his account, one of the unhappiest populations among comparable economies, evidence, he argues, that something deeper than working conditions is driving the decline. The American system looks almost inverted, a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, or $2.13 plus tips for many service workers, roughly a third of the UK's rate, with no federally mandated maternity leave and comparatively few statutory protections. And yet, on the numbers Bartlett brings to the table, the average American salary sits around $74,000 against roughly $50,000 in the UK, even after subtracting the $6,000 to $8,000 a year an average American household spends on healthcare premiums and out-of-pocket costs, a burden UK workers don't carry. Thanks to the National Health Service, American workers still come out meaningfully ahead in disposable income. Hanauer attributes part of the UK's underperformance to Brexit, which he estimates has cost the country 8 to 10% of growth and measurably damaged both unemployment and productivity. Priestley counters that the same pattern of generous worker protections paired with public frustration shows up in Germany, Australia, and Canada, suggesting the American outlier isn't its lack of safety net but something structural in how each economy allocates ownership and opportunity. Both agree that the populist anger they call the pitchforks is rising in both countries regardless of how generous the safety net is. When homes become financial assets. Priestley frames every house as carrying two kinds of value, a utility value, which is simply having a place to live, and a speculative financial value, which is what a fund is willing to pay for the future rental income the property can generate. When investors buy purely for the second kind of value, ordinary buyers are priced out of the first. Hanauer traces this back to the broader neoliberal consensus that treats housing, like most assets, as something whose only purpose is to generate returns for capital rather than shelter for families, turning growing numbers of ordinary people into permanent renters. The deeper stakes of this shift, for Hanauer, go beyond affordability. He recounts an interview from the unrest following George Floyd's death, in which a woman was asked why people showed so little respect for property, and answered simply that she and everyone she knew owned nothing, so there was no property to respect. For Hanauer, this captures something essential: inequality is not simply an economic inconvenience, it corrodes the basic sense of reciprocity that holds a society together, and ownership, real, tangible ownership, is central to restoring it. Ownership as the missing piece. This is where Priestley locates his sharpest disagreement with Hanauer. He argues that capitalism, at its root, is ownership. If you own nothing, you are not really a participant in the system, no matter how well you are paid. He points to three concrete models worth building on. The first is the sovereign wealth fund. Norway took its share of North Sea oil in the 1980s and placed it into a fund owned collectively by its citizens, reinvesting the proceeds for the public benefit, while Britain instead sold a license to British Petroleum and captured comparatively little lasting national wealth from the same resource. Singapore runs a similar model, and Priestley notes that Britain itself once operated something structurally similar through the East India Company centuries ago. The second model is the baby bond, giving every newborn a starting stake in the stock market, on the order of $1,000, that compounds for 18 years until the child reaches adulthood with a genuine asset to build on. Both men note that the United States is already experimenting with a version of this idea. The third is broader ownership of housing and small business itself, which the earlier sections of the conversation already established as increasingly out of reach. Hanauer doesn't disagree with the goal, but is skeptical of one commonly proposed mechanism: giving employees stock in the companies they work for. In his experience, this consistently fails in practice, because most workers, facing immediate financial pressures, will choose cash over equity every time it's offered. There is, in his words, no real-world example of broad-based stock ownership working as a substitute for wages. His view is that ownership has to start with people earning enough to save something in the first place, which loops back to his argument for higher, better enforced wage standards as the necessary foundation beneath any ownership strategy. Lessons from history: the Engels pause. Priestley places the current moment inside a much older pattern he calls the K-shaped economy. Rather than the whole economy rising or falling together like a tide, one segment climbs sharply while another falls, at the same time. He draws a direct parallel to the period historians call the Engels pause, roughly 1790 to 1840, during the early Industrial Revolution in Britain. New technology, the steam engine, the spinning loom, the tractor, dramatically increased the returns to whoever owned it, while the people whose labor it replaced saw their living standards stagnate or decline for 2 to 3 generations. A single farm with a tractor could do the work of 100 field laborists, who then flooded into cities looking for work all at once. That era produced both Charles Dickens's novels chronicling urban poverty and Karl Marx's political theories, two very different responses to the same disruption. Hanauer's addition to the story is about how the imbalance was eventually corrected, not automatically, but through decades of political organizing, the rise of labor unions, and new labor standards that forced a fairer division of the gains. The lesson both men draw is that a technological shock this size does not resolve itself on its own. It requires deliberate policy choices, sustained over a long period, to convert disruption into shared prosperity rather than permanent division. Taxing global giants. Priestley's proposed fix for corporate tax avoidance borrows from an old broadcasting concept. He notes that platforms like YouTube serve enormous volumes of advertising-supported video to British audiences while booking the associated revenue through other jurisdictions, and argues these platforms should instead pay a flat broadcast-style license fee tied directly to local viewership or engagement, a structure that would be far harder to route around than corporate profit reporting. Bartlett complicates this with real-world counterexamples. When countries introduce taxes based on where users are located, major platforms often respond not by absorbing the cost but by raising prices for local consumers and businesses, or in some cases withdrawing service altogether. Canada's Online News Act, intended to make platforms pay local publishers, led Meta to simply block all news content for Canadian users rather than comply. And when several American states tried to tax Amazon based on its network of local affiliate marketers, Amazon's response was to terminate thousands of affiliate accounts in those states rather than collect the tax. Hanauer's answer is that these workarounds only exist because tax rules are set jurisdiction by jurisdiction. A genuinely coordinated global framework would remove the option to simply relocate or withdraw. He extends this to individuals as well as corporations, arguing that citizens should owe tax to their home country wherever in the world they choose to live, much as the United States already requires of its own citizens. Priestley pushes back, drawing on his own experience as an Australian who built a new life and a family in the UK over 20 years. Individuals, he argues, should be free to genuinely relocate, and the real culprits are corporate structures, not personal mobility. He also points to a specific design flaw in the UK's tax code as evidence. Income above roughly £100,000 is taxed at a punishing 62% before dropping back to 45% further up the scale, compared with the United States, where the top marginal rate doesn't apply until income passes roughly $700,000, a structure he says actively pushes Britain's most ambitious earners to relocate abroad. The case for small business. Priestley's central policy prescription is to deliberately tilt the economic playing field toward small business. He cites the estimate that small businesses generate around 70% of all new jobs, far outpacing governments or large corporations, and argues that if 100,000 entrepreneurs each hired just 10 people, that alone would create 1 million jobs and 1 million new points of optionality for workers. He describes the towns people most want to live in as the ones with a dense mix of small, locally owned businesses, a butcher, a baker, a family-run pub, rather than a handful of national chains, because that density creates both economic resilience and a genuine sense of community ownership. He grounds this in the story of a friend who owns a pub that stays full most nights of the week and yet still lost £180,000 last year once VAT, rising costs, and minimum wage obligations were accounted for, even as the same friend trains first-time workers and serves as one of the only employers in his town. Independent pubs in Britain are closing at a rate of roughly 2 a day, even as the large corporations that Priestley considers the real drain on the economy can easily absorb the same costs, partly because they are not paying comparable tax in the first place. One of the specific threats facing that pub is a private equity fund seeking to buy it and convert it into flats, the same financialization dynamic discussed earlier in the housing conversation, now applied to a community's local businesses. Hanauer's response is not to reject this but to extend it. He agrees that the playing field should be actively tilted toward small and medium-sized businesses, and describes his own involvement with a new initiative called Enterprise Britain, co-founded by entrepreneurs Brent Hoberman and Steve Fitzpatrick, aimed at making Britain a more competitive environment for smaller companies specifically. His proposed mechanism is progressive regulation, apply the highest wage standards and the most detailed compliance requirements to the largest companies, with proportionally lighter burdens on small businesses, while also expanding access to capital through government-backed lending programs, pointing to Britain's existing scheme that underwrites the first £25,000 of a small business loan as a working example. Both men agree there is a meaningful difference between entrepreneurs building companies to scale and exit and small business owners who simply want to run a shop, a pub, or a family firm indefinitely, and that policy should make room for both. Artificial intelligence and the future of work. The conversation turns to what both consider the most urgent open question: how disruptive artificial intelligence will be to jobs, and how quickly. Bartlett cites data showing entry-level job postings falling consistently, along with Uber's own statement that its 9 million drivers are expected to eventually lose their jobs to autonomous vehicles, and a demonstration from Figure AI in which a humanoid robot outperformed a human at sorting packages on a production line for 8 straight days. He also raises a report from Anthropic suggesting that a single person working with a team of AI agents could eventually build a $1 trillion company without hiring anyone at all, alongside an anecdote about an Anthropic engineer who said he hadn't personally written a line of code in months because an AI agent now does it for him. Hanauer offers a more measured historical parallel. When calculators first arrived in classrooms, people feared it would be the end of arithmetic skill. When personal computers arrived, many assumed they would eliminate work, but computers instead expanded the total amount of work people did. He argues AI could follow a similar path, because businesses compete in one of two ways: by being cheaper, or by being better, and a company that keeps its people and gives them powerful AI tools can have each person do the work of several while outcompeting rivals on quality, rather than simply cutting headcount. Priestley backs this with a concrete example. A husband and wife video production business in the north of England used AI to build a piece of software almost for free, attracted 5,500 people to a waiting list, signed up 1,500 paying clients within 4 months, and is now hiring a team of 10. A scale of opportunity that would have required raising millions of dollars and hiring dozens of people before AI existed. Across his own portfolio of small businesses, Priestley says implementing AI has led to net hiring, not job losses, because AI expands what a small team can credibly take on. Bartlett offers a counterweight from his own experience. While there is no active intention to lay people off, natural attrition is already being used to quietly shrink certain teams, such as call centers, rather than backfilling departing staff, a pattern he says Klarna's CEO has described using the identical language. On the harder structural question of a broad AI transition, Hanauer floats a variation on Bernie Sanders' proposal that the United States government take an ownership stake, on the order of 50%, in leading AI companies, modeled loosely on how Norway captured the value of a national resource through its sovereign wealth fund, and recycled the proceeds to cushion the disruption AI will inevitably cause. He's careful to frame this as an experiment rather than a fully worked-out policy, arguing that the downside risk, a handful of already wealthy founders ending up somewhat less wealthy, is modest compared with the potential upside of spreading AI's gains more broadly. Priestley is more skeptical, warning that this kind of intervention risks driving digital companies to simply relocate their operations to more favorable jurisdictions, leaving behind public debt raised against assets that may never perform as hoped. Both agree that this is a genuine unknown, and that democracies will need to experiment with several approaches rather than assume any single mechanism will work as designed. Government competence and the size of the state. Priestley's deepest reservation about policy solutions is not the ideas themselves but who would be trusted to implement them. He cites a specific statistic: workers in the UK government are roughly 10 times more likely to die on the job than to be fired for poor performance, and the government dismisses staff for incompetence at a rate he estimates is 600 times lower than in private business. To him, this points to a much larger accumulation of misaligned incentives across government generally, which makes him wary of handing any institution, public or private, more power without first fixing how it is run. He holds up Singapore as a rare counterexample, a government that promotes and dismisses based on merit and outcomes, producing what both men separately describe as one of the most competently run states in the world, alongside Dubai as another unusual case of effective, if undemocratic, governance. Hanauer accepts the diagnosis of incompetence but rejects the conclusion that government itself is therefore the problem. He points out that large corporations fail just as often and just as expensively, citing his own experience watching Microsoft acquire his fast-growing internet advertising company for $6.4 billion, only to write off the entire value within 5 years. His broader argument is that there is no example anywhere in history of a genuinely high-functioning society without a substantial, capable government, because only government has ever had the scale to counterbalance concentrated corporate power. The two find agreement here, even if they arrive from different directions. Both want government reform toward the competence and accountability of the Singaporean model, rather than eliminated or drastically shrunk, and both see private sector incompetence as just as real a problem as public sector incompetence. Between two extremes, the narrow corridor. Toward the end of the conversation, Hanauer lays out the theoretical frame underlying his entire argument. He rejects both ends of the traditional spectrum, state-controlled socialism, which he says can only redistribute existing wealth rather than create new prosperity, eventually leaving everyone poorer, and laissez-faire capitalism, which generates faster growth but concentrates that growth so heavily at the top that it becomes politically and socially unsustainable. He borrows a term from political scientists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, the narrow corridor, to describe the space between these extremes, where markets are allowed to function as the engine of innovation, but active policy ensures the resulting gains are broadly shared. He argues the data supports this as an economic optimum, not merely a moral one. The decades of shared productivity growth before 1975 produced the fastest sustained GDP growth in American history, and growth slowed precisely when that inclusion broke down. He illustrates the underlying mechanism with a distinction between two kinds of games. Rock, paper, scissors is agodic, each round is independent of the one before it. Monopoly is non-agodic, early rolls of the dice compound over time, so that a player who lands a few good outcomes early on tends to keep winning, while a player who falls behind tends to keep falling further behind, regardless of skill. Hanauer argues real economies behave far more like monopoly than like rock, paper, scissors. Outcomes are shaped by luck, timing, and where a person starts, and both advantages and disadvantages compound over a lifetime. Because of this, he argues, a stable middle class has never emerged automatically from economic growth alone. It has always been a deliberate policy construction, built and maintained on purpose, and it can be rebuilt the same way if a society chooses to. The final inch, where they still disagree. By the end of the conversation, both men describe themselves as being remarkably close in their diagnosis, even if they frame their remaining disagreement differently. Priestley says he has watched policies like Hanauer's, minimum wage increases, stronger labor standards, actually implemented in the UK over 2 decades, and concludes they are necessary but not sufficient, because people are more than consumers or wage earners, they want a stake in something. His non-negotiable list is that ordinary people need a realistic path to owning a home, owning a business, and owning shares in the fastest-growing parts of the economy, and that without this, no amount of wage policy will fully answer the anger he sees building in both Britain and the United States. Hanauer doesn't dispute the goal, he agrees enthusiastically with all 3 of Priestley's ownership priorities, but questions the path Priestley implies, since Priestley's own route to wealth involved building small businesses that few people are positioned to replicate, and most people who do reach financial comfort get there as professionals working inside larger organizations rather than as founders. His conclusion is that both approaches have to run in parallel, an aggressive push to help more people start and own small businesses, exactly as Priestley describes, alongside a set of enforceable standards that ensure the far larger number of people who will always work for medium and large companies are paid enough, and treated well enough, to live with genuine dignity and eventually build ownership of their own. Neither man claims to have a complete blueprint for the transition ahead, particularly with artificial intelligence reshaping the picture in real time. But both agree that the shape of the middle class was never an accident of market forces to begin with, and that rebuilding it will